Ecology is a topic that many of us have a pretty decent grasp on in general, but a lot of times we tend to struggle with some of the terms and some of the basic information. So we know you've talked about this in the elementary schools and middle schools a little bit. We just want to kind of add to some of this and give it a little bit more complexity. Also, we want to review a little bit of the basics to make sure that you actually have a grasp of some of these things. So let's get a straight definition of ecology as we get started. Ecology is the study of the interactions among organisms in their environment. So we think about the living things and how they interact with everything around them, whether it be living or non-living. We have this crazy looking diagram here, and really if we look at the outside of it, it shows our most general kind of description of our environment, and that would be the biosphere. We know the root bio means life. So biosphere means the portion of the planet where life exists. Air, land, sea. And next comes a biome. A biome is a group of ecosystems with a similar climate and dominant communities. So when we talk about biomes, we might talk about our deciduous forests, which is an area that we live in where we primarily have trees with leaves that lose their leaves in the wintertime. Similar climate as well. An ecosystem is our more specific area now. We're narrowing down our regions. An ecosystem are the organisms in the environment in a given area. The community is one population of organisms in a given area. So a community includes all of the populations of all of the organisms in a given area. A population is really just the same species in a given area. And then we have an individual. So when you think of the difference between a population and a community, a population is all the same species in a given area, so it's just one species. So we might talk about the population of squirrels here in Mayapack. When we talk about the community includes all of the populations of all of the species. So in Mayapack, we wouldn't talk about just the squirrels, but we might talk about the squirrels, we might talk about the fish in the lake and the people, and we might talk about the birds, and we could even include that crazy moose that comes along once in a while. The ecosystem then moves on to be a little bit more generic, and the ecosystem not only includes the living things, but it includes the non-living things in the environment. So that's the main difference between the community and the ecosystem. Our ecosystem now adds in the non-living things like the air and the soil and the water. We need to refresh our memory on the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph. So there's a couple of terms that we use for autotroph, and that's also called a producer. So an autotroph or a producer is something that can make its own food. We typically talk about glucose as being the food that they make from water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. Now, that's just an autotroph that uses photosynthesis. At some point in time, you may talk about organisms that can carry out other processes, but we do know that this includes plants, algae, and certain types of bacteria. So remember, photosynthesis is where we take water and carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight and enzymes, and that makes sugar, water, and oxygen, which gets released to the atmosphere. The idea with the autotroph is they do not need to eat food. They can make their own food using inorganic substances. They're really the connection between the sun and the rest of the food chain. A heterotroph, or a consumer, is something that relies on other organisms for their food source. So they have to eat somehow, some way, whether it's eating like we do through our mouth, or like a fungus releasing digestive enzymes onto something that it's decaying and absorbing those nutrients. But they cannot make their own food. So essentially the consumers rely on the producers for their food. Without the producers, we would have no consumers. We wouldn't have any way to get the energy from the sun into our food chain. We need to get into the different types of heterotrophs. So we have an herbivore, which eats only plants. We have a carnivore, which eats only animals. An omnivore, which eats plants and animals. A scavenger, which will feed on the remains of dead things. And then a decomposer, which breaks down and recycles organic matter. So when we think of decomposers, we typically think of bacteria, which will help to rot as we would normally think of things. So in our environment, we have certain factors that come into play and influence us. And those two factors are called abiotic and biotic factors. We'll look at the abiotic first. The abiotic factors are the non-living factors that can influence an ecosystem. And those include things like temperature, precipitation, minerals, the soil. Anytime you see an A in front of a term, it means non. So we know bio means life. Abio would be not life. So these are the non-living. Just like asexual was not sexual reproduction. Biotic, we know bio means life. So biotic factors are the living factors that influence the environment. These are typically the interactions between those living organisms. So the plants, the animals, the bacteria, the fungus, and how they interact with each other. The abiotic and biotic factors make up our ecosystem. The living and the non-living make up the ecosystem. We need to refresh our memory on the differences between the term habitat and niche. So a habitat is a place where the organism lives. So you might think of the habitat of a deer being in the forest. A niche is not only the place where the organism lives, but it's also how it interacts with the different factors, the abiotic and the biotic factors. It's kind of like its role in the community, as I like to call it sometimes. So this is where they eat and live and reproduce and how they interact with all of those things in their environment as well. In terms of our environment, you technically can only have one niche per environment at a time. So if that niche is shared, we'll have competition. And we discussed this when we did our unit on evolution. When organisms are sharing the same niche, they will compete for those resources. They'll compete for the food, they'll compete for the mates, they'll compete for shelter. And if there's too much competition, one of those organisms may die out. So we say that they're competing for limited resources, like the food and the shelter and the mates. Another term that we need to talk about that really goes along with the biotic factors and how organisms interact with each other are what are called symbiotic relationships or symbiosis. And symbiosis is when two organisms live closely together and interact with each other. And there are three main types of symbiosis or symbiotic relationships that we discuss in this class. The first one is mutualism. And mutualism or mutualistic might be a word that you're somewhat familiar with, and that might help you out with the definition a little. But it basically means that both species are benefiting from the relationship. So we often refer to that with a plus symbolism because they're both getting something positive out of the relationship. So an example might be a flower and a bee. The flower has pollen that the bee is attracted to. The bee gets attracted to the pollen, the nectar, and as the bee eats the nectar and feeds on the nectar, that's that nice sugary source, it gets all covered in that sugary nectar, and it ends up getting the pollen attracted to all of the little fuzzy hairs on its legs and everything else. And then it goes over to the next flower, and as it eats the nectar in the next flower, that pollen gets deposited in that flower. And it just so turns out that the pollen is actually a reproductive structure for the plant. It's essentially sperm for flowers. So it ends up depositing the sperm on that particular flower, and it ends up helping that flower to sexually reproduce. So that's what they call it, pollinating. They're really helping to pollinate our plants. The flower benefits because it gets its pollen spread around in order to sexually reproduce. The bee benefits because it's getting some food from the nectar. Our next relationship is called commensalism. This is one that you may not be quite as familiar with. It's where one organism benefits and the other organism is neither helped nor harmed. So we represent this as a +0, the benefit and nothing. So there are some examples for this. Barnacles on a whale are one example. The barnacles are kind of attached to the whale as the whale is swimming through the ocean. And as the whale swims through the ocean, the barnacles are filter feeders. They're kind of like a clam or a mussel kind of organism. And they filter the particles out of the water and feed on some of the small microscopic kind of organisms. So as they're swimming along attached to the whale in the ocean, they're getting food. The whale really is not usually harmed by the barnacles unless it becomes way too numerous. The whale doesn't necessarily really care. So the whale doesn't benefit from the relationship. It isn't harmed from the relationship. So that's the one that is neither harmed nor helped. Parasitism is our last relationship that we talk about. A parasitic relationship is where one organism benefits and the other one gets harmed. So we show this as a plus-minus relationship. A good example of this is a tapeworm in an animal's intestines. The tapeworm is the parasite in this case. This is the one that benefits, because what happens is the tapeworm lives and grows in your intestines, and it takes your food that you did all the work of taking in and finding and eating and partially digesting for it, and it just takes it. You don't get the energy from the food that it steals, and you get harmed by it because you're losing out on that energy, and you put a lot of effort into finding and locating that food and digesting it, so you end up getting harmed from it because you're robbed of those nutrients, and the tapeworm benefits. A similar relationship like this is a tick and a human, or a tick and a dog. The tick is the parasite that benefits. The dog or the human is the one that gets harmed. This is not a predatory relationship where we're killing another organism, but we do have them harmed. The one relationship that you notice we did not represent here is a minus-minus relationship. A minus-minus relationship really truly doesn't necessarily exist in nature, because if both organisms are getting harmed, theoretically they're both going to be killed off and the relationship would no longer exist. So those don't necessarily happen in nature on a regular basis. Another term that we need to refer to is something called population growth, and it really helps us to understand interactions in the environment. Population growth is really just the birth rate versus the death rate, and also comparing it with migration. So we have two different types of population growth that we like to discuss. The first is exponential, and the second one is called logistic. Exponential growth is that the individuals will grow at a constant rate. And we tend to have this very high rate of growth right here on this part of the graph. The graph would kind of look like this. Typically with exponential growth, it'll be slow to start off and then it'll kind of skyrocket. In this case with exponential growth, you usually have unlimited resources for the organisms. The best organisms to show exponential growth would be bacteria, and humans actually have shown exponential growth over time because we're so good at getting resources and using them. Logistic growth is where the growth is limited by some sort of resource availability. So we go back to our limiting factors. The factor that causes a decrease in a population would be our limiting factor. So in some cases, you may be limited by food, and you may have the population soar and increase in numbers when the food is plenty, and then that population may dip down when it has eaten too much of the food and their numbers have gone down. So typically you'll see the population grow up until what we call something called the carrying capacity, which the carrying capacity is the number of individuals an environment can support. And this is controlled by these limiting factors and the interactions in the environment. So essentially the population will sort of hover around the carrying capacity. It may waver up and down and show this kind of wave-like transition. We also see this kind of a graph when we look at predators and prey. As there are large numbers of prey, the predator population will go up. But as there become too many predators for the number of prey that are left, the predators eventually will decline until the prey have enough time to increase the numbers back up again, and so on and so forth over time. So that's it for some of the basic terms for ecology. We'll review a few more as we go on, and hopefully it kind of refreshed your memory on a few terms that maybe you were a little fuzzy on in the past.